We often see him through the stained glass of cathedrals or the epic scale of Hollywood cinema. We see the hands that healed the leper and calmed the storm. But we rarely look at the hands of Jesus when they were stained with the purple juice of a crushed fig or covered in the fine gray dust of a barley harvest. Think for a moment. When the sun began to dip behind the limestone hills of Galilee and the long shadows stretched across the dust of the Roman roads, what did Jesus actually eat? We are intimately familiar with the miracle meals. We know the story of the 5,000 fed with a boy's lunch, and we hold the bread and wine of the Last Supper as the pinnacle of sacred tradition. But between the miracles and the sacraments lay 3 years of ordinary, grueling travel. Thousands of miles covered on foot, through searing desert heat and damp mountain mist. In those thousands of miles, there were thousands of forgotten meals. Jesus did not live on divine manna falling from the sky. He lived on the grit and the yield of the earth. He experienced the sharp pang of mid-afternoon hunger and the dry, sticky thirst of a traveler who hasn't seen a well in 10 miles. To understand Jesus, we must move past the theological icons and step into the historical reality of a first-century peasant Mediterranean. This is an anthropological journey into the smells of wood smoke and fermented fish, the texture of coarse stone-ground bread, and the social politics of the shared bowl. Why does this matter? Because the way a person eats reveals how they belong to the world. By looking at his daily diet, the humble, repetitive, and often scarce food of the road, we discover a Jesus who was profoundly grounded in our human struggle. We find a man who didn't just teach about daily bread, but worked for it, carried it in his pack, and broke it with the calloused hands of a traveler. Join us as we reconstruct the menu of the Messiah, not the feast of a king, but the survival rations of a wandering teacher on the move. Let's step onto the road and eat as he ate. To understand the daily life of Jesus, we must first understand the soil under his sandals. Galilee in the first century was not a desert. It was a lush, vibrant, green and gold patchwork of industry. It was the breadbasket of the region, yet it was a land of sharp contrasts, where the abundance of the earth often bypassed the mouths of those who tilled it. The agricultural landscape of Galilee. The Galilee of Jesus' time was a Mediterranean highland characterized by basalt hills and fertile valleys. To the east lay the shimmering Sea of Galilee, a freshwater heart that pumped life into the surrounding plains. The climate dictated a rhythmic existence. The former rains of autumn softened the earth for plowing, while the latter rains of spring swelled the grain. The landscape was dominated by the Mediterranean triad: grain, grapes, and olives. As Jesus walked from Nazareth to Capernaum, he would have passed endless terrace walls, holding up silver-leafed olive groves and sprawling vineyards. These weren't just scenery, they were the caloric pillars of the ancient world. The peasant diet structure. For the common person in Galilee, food was not about flavor profiles, it was about fuel. The peasant diet was overwhelmingly plant-based. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for major festivals or the occasional sacrifice. A typical person's diet consisted of about 70 to 80% carbohydrates, mostly derived from grains. The structure of the day usually involved 2 meals, a light midday snack, often eaten in the fields or on the road, and a more substantial evening meal when the heat subsided. For a traveler like Jesus, these meals had to be portable, durable, and dense. The grain economy, life and death. Grain was the currency of the poor. The valleys of Galilee produced 2 primary crops, wheat and barley.
Wheat was the gold standard used by the wealthy and for temple offerings. Barley was the food of the poor. It was hardier, cheaper, and coarser. When we imagine Jesus and his disciples plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath, they were likely eating raw barley kernels, a crunchy, chewy, frequent substitute for a cooked meal. The grain economy was also a site of struggle. Much of this harvest was taxed away by Rome or the Herodian elite, meaning the daily bread Jesus prayed for was a literal plea for survival. The fishing culture of the Sea of Galilee. While the hills provided grain, the lake provided protein. The fishing industry around the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, was a massive commercial enterprise. In towns like Magdala, fish were processed on an industrial scale. However, a peasant traveler wouldn't be eating fresh grilled tilapia every day. Most fish was preserved. Because fresh fish rots in hours under the Galilean sun, it was immediately salted, dried, or pickled in brine. This processed fish was the travel-stable protein that likely filled the disciples' packs, salty, pungent, and meant to be eaten in small, savory bites with bread. Seasonal availability and preservation. The diet changed with the calendar. Spring, fresh beans, lentils, and green herbs. Summer, grapes, figs, and pomegranates. Autumn, the olive harvest and the pressing of new oil. Winter, dried fruits, stored nuts, and salted meats. Preservation was a survival skill. Grapes were stepped into wine or dried into raisins. Olives were cured in lye or brine to remove their bitterness, and figs were pressed into dense, sugar-rich cakes that could last for months, the original energy bars for a long journey through the wilderness.
Class differences, the Great Divide. There was a gastronomic gulf in the first century. While the elite in cities like Sepphoris or Tiberias dined on imported spices, fine white flour, and choice cuts of meat, the peasant class, the class Jesus belonged to, ate black or gray bread. The wealthy used olive oil for cooking, lamps, and cosmetics. The poor used it sparingly as their primary source of fat. When Jesus sat at a table, the very presence of certain foods spoke volumes. To eat a meal of only bread and salt was an act of poverty. To share a meal with fish or wine was a celebration of community. By choosing the diet of a Galilean traveler, Jesus was intentionally stepping into the life of the middle to lower class, a life of simple, seasonal, and often precarious nutrition. In the first century, bread was not a side dish, it was the meal itself. Everything else, a few olives, a piece of onion, or a smear of lentil paste, was simply a relish or opson to help the bread go down. For Jesus and his followers, bread was the literal engine of their mission. Barley versus wheat, the bread of the masses. The type of bread in Jesus' pack told a story of social standing. Wheat bread, artos, was soft, white, and expensive, the luxury of the urban elite and the temple hierarchy. Barley bread, however, was the gritty reality of the Galilean peasant. Barley was cheaper to grow and could survive in poorer soil. It produced a heavy, dark, and somewhat nutty loaf that was high in fiber but prone to becoming rock-hard quickly. When the Gospels mention the 5 barley loaves used to feed the multitude, it's a specific detail highlighting the poverty of the crowd. Jesus' daily sustenance was almost certainly this coarse, gray barley bread, the fuel of the laborer. The craft of the loaf. Bread making was a daily communal labor. It began with the rhythmic sound of the hand mill, 2 basalt stones grinding grain into a rough flour. This flour was mixed with water and a starter culture, leaven, saved from the previous day's batch. Most villages utilized a community oven or taboon. These were beehive-shaped clay structures fueled by dried dung or brushwood.
because wood was scarce, the entire neighborhood would bake their loaves together to conserve heat. For Jesus, the smell of wood smoke and fermenting dough wasn't just a domestic aroma, it was the smell of the village heart. The ultimate travel food. On the road, bread took the form of the flatbread. Unlike the thick loaves we see today, first-century bread was often thin and flexible, similar to a modern pita or laffa. This design was purely functional. Durability, thin bread dried out less awkwardly than a thick loaf. Portability, it could be stacked, wrapped in a cloth, and tucked into a para, a traveler's leather scruff or bag. Utility, in a world without forks or spoons, the bread was the utensil. It was used to scoop up thick stews or wrap around a piece of salted fish. Breaking bread, the custom of connection. In Jewish culture, bread was so sacred that it was never cut with a knife. It was always broken by hand. To break bread was a profound social contract. When Jesus sat on a dusty roadside and tore a piece of barley bread to hand to Peter or John, he wasn't just sharing calories, he was sharing his very life. This custom created a shared humanity. There were no individual plates. Everyone dipped their broken piece into a common bowl. If you ate someone's bread, you were under their protection, and they were in your circle of peace. A symbol beyond the miracle. While the church later focused on the miraculous multiplication of bread, the daily reality for Jesus was the scarcity and sanctity of the loaf. Bread represented the intersection of human toil and divine provision. To hold a piece of bread was to hold the result of plowing, sowing, waiting for rain, harvesting, winnowing, grinding, and baking. When Jesus looked at his disciples over a simple meal of dry flatbread on the way to Jerusalem, the bread served as a reminder they were grounded in the earth, dependent on each other's hands, and sustained by the most humble of elements. Next, shall we look at the relish that accompanied the bread? In Chapter 4, we'll explore fish, olives, dates, and the simple proteins that kept them moving. If bread was the foundation of Jesus' diet, the relish, or upsan, provided the essential fats and proteins required to sustain a body walking 15 to 20 miles a day. On the road, nutrition was stripped down to its most functional form, small, dense, and intensely flavored. The fish economy, salt and brine. While the disciples were fishers of men, they were first men of the Galilean fish trade. But as travelers, they rarely ate fresh fish roasted over a fire. That was a luxury of the shoreline. For the journey into the interior hill country, they relied on the Magdala fish. Magdala, a city on the lake's edge, was the center of a massive salt curing industry. Fish were sliced open, packed in coarse sea salt, or submerged in a pungent fermented fish sauce called garum. These small, dried fish acted like protein jerky. They were salty enough to encourage water intake and preserved enough to last weeks in a traveler's pack. A single dried sardine-like fish, broken into pieces, could provide the necessary savory kick to a dry piece of barley bread. The power of the olive. Olives were the primary source of fat for Jesus and his followers. They were ubiquitous and rugged. A handful of cured olives provided a burst of sodium and healthy fats that protected the body from the exhaustion of the Judean sun. Olive oil was even more precious. It wasn't just a food, it was a medicine and a light source. On the road, a small leather skin of oil was a vital provision. A disciple might pour a few drops of oil onto a piece of hard bread to soften it, making a meager meal feel like a feast. Nature's energy bars, dates and figs. For quick energy during a steep climb toward Jerusalem, Jesus would have turned to fruit. Dates and figs were the energy bars of antiquity. Dates, high in sugar and minerals, they were often pressed into compact cakes. Figs, when dried, become intensely sweet and durable. These fruits provided the glucose necessary for long-distance trekking. They were the perfect survival food. They didn't spoil, they were light to carry, and they provided an immediate caloric boost when blood sugar levels dipped during a long day of teaching. Scarcity and simple proteins. True meat, lamb or goat, was a rarity. Instead, protein came from legumes and nuts. Lentils, chickpeas, the ancestor of modern hummus, and fava beans were boiled into thick, portable pastes. Walnuts and almonds, harvested in the fall, provided a crucial source of protein and magnesium. However, we must remember the reality of protein scarcity. Jesus didn't have a balanced diet in the modern sense. His nutrition was a constant calculation of survival. Simple nutrition meant a meal that was often just a few olives, a shriveled fig, and a piece of bread, enough to keep the heart beating and the legs moving toward the next village.
The ministry of Jesus was a ministry of movement. To follow him was to be in a state of constant transit, navigating the limestone ridges of Upper Galilee or the sweltering lowlands of the Jordan Valley. In this context, eating was rarely a stationary event. It was a logistical challenge of survival, dictated by the pace of the road and the contents of a traveler's scrip. The logistics of the para. Every traveler carried a para, a sturdy leather pouch slung over the shoulder. For the disciples, this wasn't just a personal bag, it was a communal pantry. Because they traveled as a group, they practiced a primitive form of shared economy. One disciple might carry the dried fish, another the skins of wine or water, and another the heavy stacks of barley flatbread. Eating while walking was common. Unlike the formal reclining seen in later banquet scenes, daily survival eating was often done on the move. They would tear off chunks of bread and eat them with a few raisins or nuts as they walked, maintaining a steady pace to reach the next village before nightfall. Carry foods versus foraging. The disciples lived in a tension between what they carried and what they found. Their carried provisions were security foods: dried lentil cakes, parched corn, roasted kernels of grain that provided a quick, crunchy snack. Carobs, often called St. John's bread, these were the pods of the carob tree, sweet, chewy, and durable, though often considered the food of the very poor or livestock. However, they also relied on opportunistic foraging. This is seen clearly in the Gospel accounts when the disciples plucked heads of standing grain to rub in their hands and eat. In the Mediterranean landscape, wild eating included picking wild mustard leaves, chicory, or the occasional unharvested fruit from a roadside tree. The reality of cold meals. Fire was a luxury of the stationary. On the road, Jesus and his followers almost exclusively ate cold meals. Lighting a fire required time, flint, and precious fuel, wood or dried dung, which were not always available on a wind-swept ridge. A meal was often a cold, dry affair, the texture of leather and the taste of salt. The warmth of a cooked stew was a treat reserved for when they were welcomed into a home or when they made camp for several days. Meals without tables. The concept of a table was non-existent for the wandering teacher. They ate on rocks, the dusty ground, or the grassy slopes of the hillsides. In these moments, the ground became their table and their laps became their plates. There was a profound humility in this roadside eating. It stripped away the social hierarchies of the city. Whether you were a former tax collector or a fisherman, you sat in the dirt together, sharing the same dusty bread. Hydration and the sacred well. Hydration was the critical factor of travel. In the arid climate of Judea, a human needs significant water to survive a day of walking. Their canteen was a goatskin bottle. These skins kept the water relatively cool through evaporation, but the water often took on the funky, musky taste of the leather. Wells were the lifeblood of their route.
A journey was mapped not by miles, but the distance between reliable water sources. The encounter at Jacob's well wasn't just a theological setting, it was a mandatory stop for survival. To miss a well was to risk heat exhaustion or death. Hunger between villages. We must imagine a Jesus who was often genuinely hungry. There were long stretches between the hospitable villages of Galilee and the desolate regions of the Decapolis, where food ran out. This in-between hunger was a radical spiritual crucible. It forced a radical dependence on the next town's hospitality and a physical identification with the hungry of the earth. Every bite of a dry crust on a roadside rock was a reminder of their vulnerability.
When the dust of the road finally settled and the sun dipped below the horizon, the survival eating of the wilderness gave way to the sacred theater of ancient Near Eastern hospitality. In the first century, inviting a stranger into one's home was not just a kindness, it was a moral imperative, a covenant of salt that turned a wandering traveler into a protected guest. The sacred invitation. For Jesus and his disciples, being invited to eat was the primary way they integrated into a community. A householder would stand at the village gate or the doorway of a home and offer the invitation. Once Jesus crossed that threshold, his status shifted. He was no longer a beggar or a vagabond, he was a guest of honor. This hospitality was the fuel of the early Jesus movement. It allowed a group with no permanent address to sustain a multi-year mission. The foot-washing ritual. The first course of a hospitality meal wasn't food, it was water. Before a single piece of bread was broken, the foot-washing ritual took place. After miles of walking in open-toed leather sandals on roads shared with livestock, a traveler's feet were coated in a thick layer of grime and dung. While a wealthy host might have a servant perform this task, in the humble homes of Galilean peasants, a bowl of water and a towel were provided for the guests to wash themselves. This act was the essential transition from the profane world of the road to the sacred space of the shared table. It was a physical cleansing that signaled the beginning of fellowship. Floor meals and the common bowl. Forget the high tables and chairs of Western art. In a typical villager's home, the meal took place on the floor. Guests sat or reclined on woven mats or animal skins around a low central table, which was often just a large wooden tray or a raised piece of stone. There were no individual plates. The meal was served in one or two large shared bowls placed in the center. This one bowl system was a powerful equalizer. Whether the meal was a thick lentil pottage, a stew of bitter herbs, or a rare treat of boiled goat meat, everyone reached into the same vessel. To eat from the same bowl was to say, "We are of one body." The art of bread dipping. In this setting, the bread became the ultimate tool. Since there were no forks, guests would tear off a piece of flatbread, fold it between their thumb and forefinger to create a small scoop, and dip it into the central bowl to retrieve the food. There were strict social customs to this. You only used your right hand, the left was for hygiene, and you were careful not to let your fingers touch the communal sauce. When Jesus spoke of "he who dips his hand into the bowl with me," he was describing an act of extreme intimacy, which made the betrayal of such a moment even more scandalous to the ancient mind. The social exchange, teaching for sustenance. The meal was never a free gift, it was an exchange of life. The host provided the shelter and calories, and in return, the guest provided blessing and wisdom. As the group dipped their bread into the shared oil or stew, the house became a classroom. Jesus used these moments to tell parables, to heal, and to challenge social boundaries. The meal was the social glue of the ancient world. By eating with tax collectors and sinners, Jesus wasn't just being friendly, he was using the most powerful social tool at his disposal to declare that the kingdom of God had no seating chart.
The simple act of sharing a bowl of lentils became a radical political and spiritual statement.
While we often focus on the abundance of the miracles, the historical reality of Jesus' journey was frequently defined by the absence of food. For a traveling band of radicals in the first century, hunger was not a lifestyle choice. It was a constant companion, sometimes invited through spiritual discipline, but often forced upon them by the harsh geography of the Levant. Involuntary scarcity and travel delays. The roads of Judea were unpredictable. A sudden flash flood in a wadi, a dust storm, or a mist turn could turn a one-day trek into a two-day ordeal. In these moments, the para, traveler's bag, would run dry. There were no roadside inns with guaranteed pantries. If a village turned the group away, as happened in Samaria, the disciples faced a night of involuntary fasting. This wasn't a fast for the soul, but a grueling physical reality. They would have experienced the lightheadedness, the cramping of the stomach, and the irritability that comes with a caloric deficit while performing heavy physical labor, walking. The desert and physical strain. Nowhere was this hunger more acute than in the Judean wilderness. This was a land of white hunger, a landscape of chalky limestone and blistering heat where the body burns through reserves at an accelerated rate. In the wilderness, the priority shifted from food to water. Under the desert sun, the appetite often suppresses as the body struggles to regulate temperature, leading to a state of hollow exhaustion. When the Gospels describe Jesus being hungry after 40 days, it is a reminder that his divinity did not shield his nervous system from the catastrophic strain of starvation. Voluntary fasting, the spiritual tool. Beyond forced hunger, Jesus practiced voluntary fasting. In Jewish tradition, fasting was a way to afflict the soul, to gain clarity or seek divine intervention. However, Jesus' fasting was different from the performative twice-weekly fasts of the urban elite. His was often solitary and quiet, a withdrawal from the sensory world of tasting to the inner world of the spirit. For Jesus, hunger was a thin space, a state where the barrier between the physical and the divine became porous. Group hunger moments. Hunger was also a collective experience for the 12. We see this when the disciples were so busy ministering that they did not even have a chance to eat. This group hunger created a specific kind of bonding, a shared sacrifice. When they were finally able to eat a handful of raw grain or a dry crust, that food tasted better because it was earned through communal toil. Hunger served to strip away their egos. A hungry man does not care about his status in the group. He only cares about the bread. By sharing the experience of the empty stomach, Jesus and his disciples grounded their spiritual mission in the most basic of human vulnerabilities. When the day's journey ended and the group gathered around a campfire or a low table, the act of eating shifted from a matter of survival to a ritual of community building. For the disciples, these weren't just meals, they were the war room of the movement, the place where the abstract teachings of the day were digested alongside the barley bread. The dynamics of the shared portion. In the modern world, we are accustomed to my plate and your plate. In the circle of Jesus, such a concept was entirely foreign. There were no individual portions. A single large earthenware bowl of lentil stew or a tray of dried fish and olives sat in the center of the group. This shared portioning was a physical manifestation of their common life. You could not take more than your share without literally depriving the brother sitting next to you. This created a heightened sense of awareness and mutual care. To eat with the 12 was to practice an economy of enough, where the needs of the group overrode the hunger of the individual. Radical equality at the meal. In the Greco-Roman world, seating charts were everything. The most important guests sat in the highest positions and received the best cuts of meat. Jesus radically subverted this.
Around the campfire, there was no head of the table. By sitting on the same dirt and reaching into the same bowl, the former fisherman, the former tax collector, and the revolutionary stood on equal footing. This communal eating was a leveling force. It stripped away the baggage of their past lives and forged them into a new family. In the flickering firelight, the hierarchy of the outside world melted away. Brotherhood and bonding. The meal was the primary site of brotherhood bonding. It was during these quiet hours, away from the pressing crowds, that the disciples asked their most honest questions. Between mouthfuls of bread, they laughed, they argued, and they processed the day's miracles. The clink of pottery and the sound of chewing formed the soundtrack to their most intimate moments of friendship. It was here that Peter's impulsiveness, John's ambition, and Thomas's doubts were aired and addressed. Teaching moments in the firelight. Jesus was a master of the table talk. He understood that the human heart is most open when the stomach is being satisfied. Many of his most profound insights weren't delivered on a mountaintop, but over a firelight meal. He used the elements of the meal as visual aids, the salt, the leaven in the bread, the fruit of the vine. He taught that the kingdom of God was like a great banquet where the outcasts were the guests of honor. The meal was not a break from the ministry, it was the core of it. The sacredness of the ordinary. As the fire died down to embers, the simple act of finishing a meal became a prayer of thanksgiving. For this group of travelers who never knew where their next meal was coming from, every shared bowl was a minor miracle. The bonding that occurred over these humble Galilean staples was the glue that would eventually hold them together when the road led them to the cross.
While the religious elite of the day used food to draw lines between the pure and the impure, Jesus used it to erase them. His journeys frequently took him away from the prosperous limestone villas of the Galilee and into the cramped, windowless hovels of the marginalized and the destitute. The reality of the poor man's table. In the poorest homes of first-century Judea, a meal often looked like a tragedy. There were no multi-course spreads. Often there was nothing more than a bowl of coarse, sandy barley porridge or a few stalks of wild hyssop dipped in vinegar. The homes were dark, shared with livestock, and smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. When Jesus entered these spaces, he practiced a radical simplicity and humility. He didn't wait for a clean tablecloth or a proper vessel. By sitting on a dirt floor with those society had discarded, the lepers, the sinners, and the chronically poor, he validated their existence. Accepting what is offered. One of the most striking aspects of Jesus' travel ethics was his command to his disciples, "Eat what is set before you." In a culture governed by strict dietary laws and tithing requirements, this was a revolutionary act of grace. To the poor, the arrival of a holy man could be a source of anxiety. Would their meager bread be pure enough? Jesus removed that burden. By accepting what was offered without complaint, he signaled that the person giving the food was far more important than the quality of the food itself. He ate the thin soups and the stale crusts of the widow and the laborer, transforming their scarcity into a shared feast of dignity. Social boundary crossing. In the ancient world, table fellowship was a sign of total acceptance. To eat with someone was to become one with them. When Jesus ate with the marginalized, he was performing a social boundary crossing that scandalized the authorities. He wasn't just being charitable, he was declaring that the unclean were actually the guests of honor in the kingdom of God. The dignity of small meals. These meals reveal the heart of his mission, that there is a divine dignity in the small and the ordinary. To Jesus, a single olive shared in a house of mourning was more sacred than a hollow banquet in a palace. He showed that holiness isn't found in the avoidance of the unclean, but in the breaking of bread with the brokenhearted.
These humble meals were the ultimate teaching moments, proving that God's presence isn't found in the abundance of things, but in the sincerity of the sharing. When the mission of Jesus led the group away from the fertile valleys and into the Judean wilderness, the nature of eating changed from a social ritual to a grueling discipline of survival. This was a vertical landscape, a world of jagged limestone cliffs and deep canyons where life was sustained by the barest of margins, the sparse reality of the wild. In the wilderness, the menu was stripped of all variety. There were no community ovens and no hospitable neighbors. Food sources were nearly non-existent. Aside from the occasional wild beehive hidden in a rock crevice or the bitter fruit of a desert shrub, the land offered nothing to the hungry traveler. To survive, the group relied entirely on dried provisions they had hauled from the last village. These were dead foods, sun-dried figs, parched grain, and flatbread that had turned as hard as the stones they sat upon. Every bite was an exercise in persistence, requiring long mastication and precious saliva to make the dry starch swallowable. The physics of hunger, heat, and appetite. In the intense heat of the desert, where temperatures can soar above 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the human body undergoes a physiological shift. Appetite often vanishes, replaced by a dull, heavy fatigue. For Jesus and his disciples, eating became a chore rather than a pleasure. They ate not because they were hungry, but because they had to maintain the strength to reach the next water source. The absolute priority of water. In these conditions, water took total precedence over food. A human can survive weeks without bread, but only days without water in the Judean sun. Their travel routes were dictated by the location of ancient cisterns and hidden springs. Food was often rationed based on how much water they had left. If water was low, eating was dangerous, as the digestion process requires significant internal hydration. Eating under harsh conditions. There was a profound spiritual weight to eating in the wilderness. There was no shade, no table, and no comfort. They ate while hunkered in the shadow of a boulder or sitting in the dust of a dry riverbed. This was eating in the presence of the enemy being the sun and the vast, indifferent silence of the waste. For Jesus, these meals were the ultimate test of his humanity. By sustaining himself on dry crumbs and warm, leathery water in the middle of a wasteland, he demonstrated a radical endurance. It was here, in the absence of all comfort, that the true meaning of daily bread was most sharply defined. As we conclude our journey through the dusty roads and shared bowls of first-century Palestine, a striking portrait of the Messiah emerges, one that is far more grounded than we often imagine. By examining what Jesus ate, we aren't just looking at a menu, we are looking at a theology of the ordinary. A life of radical simplicity. The first thing these meals reveal is a radical simplicity. In a world where the Roman elite used food as a weapon of status, dining on exotic spices, imported wines, and feathered game, Jesus chose the diet of the vulnerable. There was no luxury in his pack. There was no excess at his fire. By living on barley bread and salted fish, Jesus made a profound statement. A meaningful life is not measured by the abundance of one's possessions, but by the depth of one's connections. His meals were a rejection of the consumerism of the ancient world. He proved that the most important things in life happen not when we are feasting in palaces, but when we are sharing what little we have on a roadside rock. The power of dependence. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of Jesus' diet was his dependence on others. He did not provide for himself through divine parlor tricks. He relied on the hospitality of strangers, the support of a group of women who funded his travels, and the shared resources of his disciples. This was an intentional vulnerability. By being the guest, Jesus taught us that we are all interconnected. He showed that there is a specific kind of grace found in needing someone else to break a loaf for you. This dependence was the daily bread of his humility, a constant reminder that to be truly human is to be in need of one another. Food as the ultimate fellowship. For Jesus, eating was never just about biological fuel. It was the ultimate act of fellowship. Every time he dipped his bread into a shared bowl, he was weaving a net of community. He redefined family not by bloodlines, but by table lines. In his world, the table was a place of radical inclusion. When he ate with the unclean, he wasn't just being polite, he was performing a miracle of social healing. He showed that the fastest way to change a heart is to share a meal. The spirituality of the spoon meant that every bite was a chance to practice love, forgiveness, and equality. The humanity of the divine. Ultimately, the forgotten meals of Jesus remind us of his absolute humanity. He knew the grit of sand in his grain. He knew the sticky sweetness of a sun-warmed fig. He knew the hollow ache of a stomach that hadn't seen a meal in 24 hours. By sanctifying these ordinary moments, he tells us that our own daily struggles, the cooking, the cleaning, the grocery shopping, and the shared dinners are not distractions from a spiritual life. They are the spiritual life. The takeaway, find him at the table. As you go about your day, remember that the Jesus of history was a man of the road who appreciated a cool drink of water and a warm piece of bread. He found God in the ordinary, the seasonal, and the shared. The next time you sit down to eat, look at your food not just as calories, but as a connection to the earth and the people around you. In the breaking of the bread, in the simplest, most humble of moments, the Spirit is always present.